All right. I'm going to begin, although I'm expecting more people will drift in as we start. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our Without Limits discussion. I'm Becca Longton from the Philosophy Department, and I have the honor of moderating today's conversation, Global Perspectives on the COVID-19 Crisis. Just a quick announcement, the second event that we scheduled for the spring that was canceled has been rescheduled. So COVID and Communities of Color with Dr. Carrie Cruz Bueno from Brown University and Dr. Cruz, Caridad Bueno from SUNY New Paltz Black Studies is rescheduled for next week, Wednesday at 5 p.m. We hope that you can join us then. Before we begin today, I wanted to thank Laura Barrett, the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, for supporting Without Limits. This yearly series gives us the opportunity to explore connections and enduring questions between humanities and the sciences, and to build dialogue between our disciplines, which is especially relevant now as we find ourselves living through a world historical moment with a global pandemic. We are also very much indebted to Despina Parker for all the work she puts into making Without Limits possible, especially now that we're remote. It's much harder to schedule and gather people together. So thank you so much, Despina, for all your work. It is a lot to organize and we're very grateful. I also want to acknowledge the other members of the Without Limits Committee, Isadora Janero from Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and Kathleen Hunt from Communication. We have 3 speakers today from different disciplines, and each speaker will give a presentation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to a general Q&A. You can see that there's an option for you to type a question. And so when we get to the conversation part where we open things up, please feel free to ask questions and we'll discuss everything together. I will begin by introducing each of our 3 speakers. Thank you, Dr. Mona Ali from Economics for joining us today. Mona Ali teaches courses in macroeconomics and international economics. Her work focuses on financial, monetary, and trade relations in the international economy. Her scholarship on American multinationals, global imbalances, Brexit, and international monetary systems has been published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, the International Review of Applied Economics, and Political Quarterly, among elsewhere. She received her PhD from the New School for Social Research in 2012, and she's working on a book on the Anglo-American economies and the coronavirus crisis, which informs her 2021 course called Crisis Economics. Her presentation today is entitled Life, Debt, and the World Dollar Order. Our second speaker, Youngli Li, is a lecturer of Chinese Studies at the Department of Languages, Literatures, Cultures, and Asian Studies programs here at SUNY New Paltz. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and conducts research on cinematic representation of Shanghai in contemporary film and media productions. She's broadly interested in film history, media industry, and urban studies. At New Paltz, she teaches courses on East Asian culture and Chinese language. Her presentation is entitled Whistleblowers, Little Pink and Celebrity Scientists, China's Social Media Culture in Pandemic Communication. Our third speaker is Ilgu Osler. She is an associate professor of political science and international relations at SUNY New Paltz. She's the founder and director of the SUNY Global Engagement Program in New York City. Her previous research focused on civic engagement as it relates to political parties, non-governmental organizations, and social movements. She has conducted research in Turkey, Mexico, and Chile. Her most recent work focuses on human rights and global governance at the United Nations. Her publications appeared in various academic journals, including Sociological Perspectives, Ethics and International Affairs, Representation, Journal of Civil Society, Democratization, Latin American Perspectives, Global Environmental Politics, Mexican Studies, and Turkish Studies. Her teaching has incorporated innovative experiential learning in courses related to the United Nations and global engagement through civil society organizations. She has been active in the United Nations Association and Amnesty International in various capacities. She served as an officer on the board of Amnesty USA from 2017 to 2020 and focused especially on global strategic planning and policy work. Osler received her PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. Her presentation is entitled The United Nations at 75, Passing the COVID Test. Thank you so much to our speakers. Our first speaker, Mona Ali, will begin. Thank you so much.
Okay, so can you see my slide? I think you can. So I'm going to start with a list of some key terms that you might want to keep in mind as we go along. I start this story with a ship that you might have encountered, a ship that blocked world trade for more than a few days in the Suez Canal. Just a quick question, can you see the slideshow for the whole screen or no?
I cannot see the slideshow right now.
Oh, you can't, okay. Can you see it now? No, okay.
I think Despina is supposed to give you a presenter position,
Yes.
So Despina?
Yes, you should have the share screen button activated.
Thanks. Okay, I didn't do that, Despina.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so here we go. And so you can see my screen, is that correct? I just don't use WebEx much. I think you can see it now, correct? Despina, you wanna?
Perfect.
Okay, lovely. So some terms to keep in mind as we go along. I'm going to start from the beginning again about the ship, the Ever Given, in the Suez Canal a couple of weeks ago. This ship is one of the largest container ships on the globe, and it was run aground by the Khamsin, these seasonal windstorms that temporarily choked up global shipping to the tune of $10 billion a day until it was cleared. So on any given day, the Suez carries a third of global container traffic. It's a shortcut from China to Europe, a conduit in the contemporary Silk Road that runs from Yantian to Rotterdam. The ship's stymied passage, I think, resonated with me because it was so symbolic of the shorted circuits of supply chains this pandemic year. Like the products it hoists, the Pelotons, the iPhones, this ship is transnational in assemblage, Japanese owned, Taiwanese managed, an Indian crew, its Panamanian flag indicating registry in that tax haven. It's also emblematic of the offshored and outsourced platforms of our global economy, where labor standards, environmental standards are compromised to generate profits that largely accrue to corporations in the global north, corporations who own the intellectual property embedded in these supply chains. We know that markups, which is the difference between price and cost, have been decreasing for producer firms in developing countries since 2018, while they've been increasing for leading firms in the OECD economies, Europe and North America mostly. Now, a century ago, Rosa Luxemburg wrote in her book, The Accumulation of Capital, that with the Suez, Egypt became caught in the web of European capitalism, never again to get free of it. The 19th century construction of this canal on the backs of 1.5 million fellahin, state conscripted forced labor, thrust Egypt into a colonial mode of capitalism. And funding this giant decade-long infrastructure project, which cost about 2 billion in today's terms, required sovereign debt issuance. The sterling borrowed were rerouted back to Europe to purchase European capital goods and repaid through the onerous taxation of the Egyptian peasantry. Suez, writes Luxembourg, formed the nucleus for Egypt's immense national debt, which was to bring about her military occupation by Britain. So, you know, formal empires have been replaced by bond markets, but this entwinement between monetary and political sovereignty remains. At the start of the pandemic, an unprecedented number of capital flows, about 150 net, exited developing economies, only to bounce back after the United States Federal Reserve pumped money into global financial markets. So what we're seeing is this acute sensitivity on the part of emerging markets to global financial conditions. Global conditions, meaning the dollar appreciating, leads to a tightening of global lending, which increases or amplifies both liquidity as well as insolvency risk in emerging markets. A year into the pandemic, once again, we're seeing a lot of volatility of financial flows as emerging markets are once again rattled by rising yields on US long-term treasuries and a rising dollar over the last couple of months. So I'm going to talk about the global dollar financial cycle a bit more. Despite a decade-long increase in local currency bond markets in emerging economies, it's still cheaper for emerging markets to borrow in dollars. So what this means is that local currency borrowing, which is meant to stabilize emerging markets from currency mismatch and from the instabilities of borrowing in a foreign currency, these local currency bonds actually amplify vulnerability faced by developing economies, as when the dollar appreciates, there leads to a sell-off in local currency denominated debt by foreign investors in emerging markets, which amplifies local currency devaluation. Borrowing in dollars by emerging market sovereigns, however, means you face a less kittish foreign investor base. And so this structural dilemma, where it's more efficient to borrow in dollars rather than in your own currency for emerging markets, reinforces the emerging market risk premium while at the same time strengthening dollar dominance. So it implies, disturbingly for emerging markets, monetary autonomy is the less market efficient outcome. Unless they find themselves, as several do now, in debt default, and then the costs of borrowing in foreign currency become exorbitant. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about acute dollar dominance, and then I'll talk about transportation and shipping. So as the world's predominant currency, the dollar is on one side of all currency trades. A latticework of dollar debt undergirds the emergent global financial system. US Treasuries are a $21 trillion market. They're not only forms of global liquidity, but foundational risk-free assets in international money markets. In fact, more dollar liquidity is generated overseas than within US borders. The City of London is the central node of offshore dollar funding, and instruments such as foreign exchange derivatives or swaps with a dollar on one leg are a key form of contemporary monetary equivalence and key to dollar funding. Post-pandemic monetary easing in the global north has propelled a record issuance in foreign law governed, meaning bonds denominated in dollars and written in the laws of New York State, and England and Wales. Those are the dominant laws that govern sovereign debt issuance in developing economies. And there's been a massive increase, a record increase in those kinds of bonds. We also want to keep in mind that post-COVID monetary and fiscal relief has been a whole 20% in advanced economies, but only 2% in the poorest of nations. So the response has been really uneven in tackling this pandemic. Meanwhile, efforts to restructure sovereign debt have stalled with the G20 debt service suspension initiative, which has been extended through the end of the year. Private creditors have continued receiving payments from cash-strapped sovereign governments, pandemic notwithstanding. So despite the immense challenges facing developing economies, the IMF's response has really been very tepid. It's asked developing economies to embrace larger exchange rate volatility. It itself has deployed only about 10% of its $1 trillion monetary firepower, and it's yet mulling over the United States' willingness, its offer to issue $650 billion in new special drawing rights. And the IMF has said it may come around to making a decision in August. Now, this belated SDR funding is going to be too little, too late. What's required in the developing world is about $3 trillion of new financing to recover from the crisis facing them right now. I argue that central bank revolutions in the heart of global finance, where monetary financing is no longer taboo, it must be tethered to de-weaponizing transnational relations. And we can do that through a global Green New Deal, akin to, a contemporary version of the Marshall Plan. Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure program has shunned private investments thus far, and it's chosen to rely on increased taxation. But John Kerry, who's Biden's climate czar, is pushing for public-private partnerships to fund this green recovery in the global south. And I argue that that's a very dangerous proposition for developing countries. It's going to entrap them in further indebtedness to private finance. I also want to close, in fact, by thinking about some of the outcomes for climate change. So this incident in the Suez prompts us to think about the impact of consumption-led growth in the global north on climate change. We also need to recognize that export-oriented growth in the global south, motivated by a peripheral sovereign's need to accumulate dollars to guard against financial crisis, also perpetuates these trade as well as ecological imbalances. So decarbonization poses a paradox. In the short run, it requires substantial funding, dollar funding, which is the easiest to get right now in our current monetary arrangement. But in the medium run, it really calls for a abandonment or overhaul of the world dollar system, which promoted export-oriented fossil fuel development in the first place. So in this race against time that net zero carbon emissions by 2050 demands, we really require multinational resolutions of these global ecological and economic imbalances. So we could have new financial instruments, such as climate or debt swaps. But I would argue that we use them in a public forum through public-led debt restructuring and climate reparations, where those least responsible for climate change, the global south, but also those paying the most in terms of the impact, they will be given funding to guide them through this difficult passage towards net zero. So it's this climate question that must center post-petrophilus geopolitics. I also want to recognize that in a zero-bound interest world, which we're in right now, the costs actually of delaying climate change mitigation are going to dramatically mushroom the longer we wait. And then finally, just to wrap things up, here's where the ever given is. Pending lawsuits in the High Court of England and Wales have actually prevented the ship from moving. It's been impounded in the Great Bitter Lake, midway through the Suez. And to me, this is a kind of a poignant name for indefinite legal purgatory. And I sure hope that this is not the path, the impasse, if you will, that developing economies face in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. To the audience, if you have questions, please type those and we'll have a general Q&A at the end. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Youngli Li. Her presentation is entitled Whistleblowers, Little Pink and Celebrity Scientists, China's Social Media Culture in Pandemic Communication. Thank you so much.
Thank you. First, let me share my slides. Okay. And could you please confirm with me that you can see my slides fine? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all for giving me this opportunity to talk about social media culture in China amid the pandemic. So similar to Mona, I also start my talk by talking about this image that I include on my slide. So this is actually from a children's book that created by a New York based children's book writer, also artist, Francesca Cavallo. So this book's name is called Dr. Li and the Corona Wearing Virus. So the Dr. Li that's included in the center on this book and in this book cover is actually Dr. Li Wenliang, who's the one of the earliest whistleblowers in China in actually January 2020. So how does this story of a Chinese origin whistleblower that based in China and travel all the way across to the US becomes one of the books in New York and for the kids. So I'm gonna kind of unveil a little bit of a story here. So since the first outbreak in Wuhan, China's social media has played a crucial role in communicating information regarding this novel coronavirus throughout the public. During the initial phase of this pandemic, where the official communication remained quiet in December 2019, whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang attempted to warn the public about it. When the complete lockdown was implemented in Wuhan around the Lunar New Year, so that was on January 23rd, 2020, the outspoken Wuhan-based writer Fang Fang also started documenting her observations and opinions daily and published on Chinese social media platforms, including the two most influential one. One is the Chinese kind of equivalent of a Twitter, Weibo, and the other one is a Chinese equivalent of a WhatsApp, WeChat. And Dr. Zhang Wenhong, who translated scientific jargons into an accessible language and made substantial public health recommendations in a clear and a timely manner, and was embraced as a celebrity scientist by netizens across various platforms, including TikTok and a couple of other video sharing platforms as well. Through them, one can better understand social media culture in China and how pandemic information has been circulated, popularized, and criticized by people there. So in this talk, I focus on the viral events on social media that change the dynamics between official and unofficial pandemic communication. And I hope to review how social media in China is being used to popularize scientific knowledge and the cultural consequences of it within China. It has been more than 1 year since the majority of China reopened and returned to an essentially normal life. And I think that at this moment, it is necessary to look back and try to understand the role that social media plays in mediating the official and unofficial, and how it was used and perceived by mass audience in China. So my talk was set to be a 15-minute. So, but of course, all three cases that I plan to unveil here are worthy of a more lengthy examination in terms of the roles they play in COVID communication and how they have helped improve the transparency of official communication with the public. Moreover, I hope to lay out some of the Chinese internet's unique characteristics through those cases. And also furthermore, I look forward to hearing your questions and the feedback afterwards. So the first case that I would like to bring to your attention is this Dr. Li Wenliang, the main character of that children's book. On January 30th, Dr. Li Wenliang, a millennial generation eye doctor at a Wuhan Central Hospital, became a household name as one of the earliest whistleblowers who warned the public regarding SARS-like pneumonia in his WeChat group chat with his old classmates. Medical circles, so those are a group of doctors who are alumni of the same university based in Wuhan, so Wuhan University. His initial warnings of those cases identified in late December of 2019 caused him to be summoned by the local police officers and also be interrogated until he agreed to sign this admonition letter. So on this slide, you can see on the left bottom corner, I included original screenshot of the group chat that was later widely circulated on social media platforms in China and also became part of the focus in the official media outlets. So for instance, this Beijing News was the leading news media set in Beijing. And on the right-hand side is the Li Wenliang's kind of a Twitter, Chinese Twitter, Weibo account. And he's kind of writing, documenting the entire process of him being interrogated, and also he posted this admonition letter. On this letter, he was urged to promise that to stop his rumor spreading activity. And 10 days later, after this incident, he was diagnosed and hospitalized for COVID because he was a doctor and he was continuing treating the patients without really knowing how infectious that disease was. So as his situation worsened in the following weeks, and the Chinese netizens were thrilled by his brave behavior and in sending the initial alarming warnings to the medical circle in Wuhan, while the news about this novel coronavirus from the official media outlets remained very limited. So, however, regardless of how much the netizens really embraced him as a hero, COVID took his life on February 7th. This soon escalated into a national and later international mourning for his loss, commemorating his contribution and bravery. Dr. Li Wenliang's social media account then on Weibo also gradually become a wailing war after his death. Chinese netizens posted new updates on COVID and shared their personal COVID experience. On the day that Wuhan lockdown was set to be lifted in early April of 2020, tens of thousands of netizens left a message on Li's original post to report on the symptom condition and sharing the excellent news with Dr. Li and wishing him well in heaven. So here on this slide, you can see on the left actually are the photos that taken by the New York Times journalists and also New Yorker journalists as well, and about this group of people gathering together in Central Park and mourning Dr. Li's pass away. And on the right-hand side is the original admonition letter that Li Wenliang, Dr. Li was signed at a the police station. So Dr. Li, as a whistleblower, certainly raised the public's awareness of the epidemic at its initial stage, exposed how the local government attempted to suppress the negative media coverage on this epidemic during the 2 sessions. So the 2 sessions is one of the most important annual party meetings. So it was in 2020 happening in Hubei province where Wuhan is in. It was around the time the mid-January. So and that was the time, so the media coverage regarding this coronavirus were all suppressed. And the lack of transparent communication with the public during the early days of outbreak. So it was kind of the reason of that. Dr. Li's personal experience in fighting COVID also encapsulated many medical experts' experience in Wuhan, who were helping the patients to their maximum capacity, even by sacrificing their own lives. It was at a time when the scientists and the medical experts had a limited knowledge on this virus, and a more in-depth scientific research was on the way. Many medical workers were facing the reality of not being aware of the infectious virus they were dealing with and the limited PPE accessibility. Another doctor that played an important role in pandemic communication is this Dr. Zhang Wenhong. In the early days of the outbreak, some doctors were appointed by the party to lead infectious disease medical team on different provincial levels. So they all play very decisive roles in communicating about COVID to the public. Dr. Zhang was one of them, and he's a Fudan University doctor, also the top university in Shanghai, and an influencer since February 2020. So here the screenshot is originally from an interview that he did with the Shanghai-based local news outlet, Xinmin Evening News, and he's this video interview went viral on TikTok and similar video sharing platforms. So for his, especially for his very humorous style and a relatable style of communication, and he gained fame on various platforms for his capability of connecting with especially the younger generation of nativisms regarding the COVID information by using very accessible language to explain medical jargons and offer both transparent information regarding the COVID control in Shanghai and nationwide, as well as offering professional advice that was both relatable and convincing. As an infectious disease expert and the head of Shanghai Medical Treatment Expert Team, amid the pandemic, he's video communicating with the public with precise data and using accessible language to urge people to obey the stay-at-home order really resonates with the audience and the nativisms across generation. To kind of call them down and unite them together in his language to fight this war against COVID. And those two doctors' story amid a COVID outbreak in China certainly provided two examples of dynamic of Chinese internet and their role in changing the communications between the government and the public. Another unique case emerged 1 year ago during the Wuhan lockdown, and a divided voice were presented on one of the leading social media platform in China, so Weibo, and on the controversial kind of this diary. It's named Wuhan Diary, published by this one of the kind of a leading Wuhan-based female writer, Fang Fang. So she's very influential female writer in China and started publishing her writings way back in 1982. So includes various fictional writings as well as poems. After she graduated from the top Wuhan University, and she had experience working in the media and started writing her award-winning novels. And during 2007 and 2018, she was also the president of Hubei Province Writers Association. So in China, the Writers Association is a kind of a party-backed cultural organization with a termed positions. Which kind of was recognized as one of the highest honors that indicated recognition from the government for a writer. So she, with that background, she actually, as a novelist, she's very outspoken, and she has published numerous well-received novel, including the one of the most recent ones published in 2016, named Softberia, which portrayed a story that said that back in 1940s, land reform in China, which was considered as very controversial and was later banned in mainland China. So during the COVID, especially Wuhan lockdown, she was living in Wuhan and experiencing it herself in her own apartment. So she started writing her diary on January 25th to document the life of a lockdown in Wuhan. It was 2 days after the official lockdown of this industrial city with a 11 million population. So during January 25th and then March 25th, she was posting her diary every day, initially on Weibo, and then later, due to the censorship, she had to move her writings around and having someone else to post on her behalf through WeChat. But her writings of those diaries really resonates with many nativisms across the generations. In the early days of the outbreak, when Wuhan went into the complete lockdown overnight, there are various social issues, especially including overburdened medical resources and many people seeking help under the lockdown on social media to raise the public awareness of their dying family members. And where on those social media platforms, governmental officials were not fully transparent when communicating information regarding the new virus. It was at that critical moment Fang started publishing her writings. Her diary talks about what she heard from her doctor friends in Wuhan regarding the new virus-related things, criticizing the official media outlets' report on the pandemic and about local government's handling of the virus and the pandemic communications. She also offers consultations to those who lost their family members, and it talks about daily miscellaneous things, including her family members' trivia things, and also buying groceries during the lockdown, those very logistical issues you have to deal with under the full lockdown as well. So just very quickly, I would like to share with you a quick excerpt from Fang's diary, and this one is from February 9th, 2020. Over the course of the past few days, the people dying from this virus seem to be getting closer and closer to me. My neighbor's cousin just died. A good friend of mine just lost his younger brother. Another friend lost her parents and grandmother to coronavirus before she herself succumbed to the disease. The people don't have enough tears left to mourn all these deaths. It is not like I've never lost a friend before who hasn't known someone who fell ill, received treatment, but eventually passed away. We all experience that. In times like that, families come together to support their sick relatives. Doctors do their best to save their patients. But in the end, sometimes none of those efforts work. You feel helpless. But we face it and the patient gradually accepts their fate. But this coronavirus outbreak is different. Those people infected early not only die, but they face hopelessness. Their cries go unanswered. Their attempts for medical intervention are useless. Their search for effective treatment proves fruitless. There are simply too many sick people and not enough beds. The hospitals simply cannot keep up with the demand. For those unlucky enough to be denied a bed, what can they do other than just sit by and wait for death? There are so many patients who thought their days would just continue to go on as peacefully as always. They assumed that if they got sick, they would just go to the doctor, but they were completely unprepared for the fact that they would be facing death so unexpectedly, not to mention the experience for being denied medical care. The pain and the helplessness they faced before death were deeper than any abyss you could ever imagine. Today, I even asked my friend, how could you possibly not be sad and depressed after living with these stories every day? Not contagious between people. It's controllable and preventable. Those 8 words have transformed Wuhan into a city of blood and tears filled with endless misery. To my dear internet censors, you had better let the people of Wuhan speak out and express what they want to say. Once they get these things off their chests, they will feel a bit better. We have already been locked down in quarantine for more than 10 days and have seen a lot of terrible things. If you won't even allow us to release some of our pain, if you can't even permit us to complain a little bit or reflect on what is happening, then you must be intent on driving us all mad. So it's one of her diary, just part of her diary from February 9th. While many netizens who followed Fang's diary appreciated her courage and writings, which provided a comfort and a crucial information for many local Wuhan people. There was also another group of netizens, many of whom were then known as Little Pink, so who criticized her as a traitor. Little Pink, this term initially emerged in 2016, and it refers to the group of ultra-nationalistic netizens who are actively online, and most like a younger generation that would yearly start expeditions to skirt around the Great Chinese Firewall to attack people's comment that sabotaged China's image in the world. After Fang Fang's work was signed by Colin Harper's to be translated into English, and of course later also in other languages, including German, in August of 2020, Many Little Pink and ultra-nationalists started rallying more online and attacked her, calling her traitor and labeling the translation projects of her diary as handing over the knives to the foreign forces. Some even went as far as sending death threats to her and also the translator of the book project. Through all three cases, social media played a role of negotiating communications between the public and the state. At the early stage, so when a nation was desperately looking for more information about this novel coronavirus, social media played a role for the whistleblowers to warn the public, while the official channels lacked transparency. It also provided new ways for experts and scientists to connect with the public to urge them to stay at home in a way that's down-to-earth, relatable, and also convincing. It also serves as a battlefield where official censors, ultra-nationalists, and public intellectuals interact. Okay, that's it for my talk. And I, again, thank you for the organizer and the panelists and the moderator. And I look forward to hear more questions from the audience later.
Thank you so much, Youngmi Lee, for this wonderful talk, which we'll discuss when we move to the Q&A part of today. I want to introduce our last speaker for today, Ilgu Osler. Her presentation is entitled "The United Nations at 75, Passing the COVID Test?" ? Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank everybody who is joining this call, because I know that there's some kind of Zoom fatigue going on, but I really appreciate you all showing up tonight for this panel. And I'm already seeing a lot of parallels and overlaps that we could have in discussion with Mona and Yongli's work. I want to start out by saying that the pandemic hit the world during the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and instead of celebrating, the UN had to contend with the pandemic. And the pandemic made it very clear that the complex issues that we have in the 21st century needs multilateral action. And the UN system is the only framework from which we have to work from. The pandemic has put the UN system to test. That's no joke. And with, it has had disastrous social, economic, and political impact globally. And the UN system, despite being this unprecedented system as the most comprehensive and ambitious mechanism for global cooperation, showed its cracks. And today, I want to examine the cracks in the system in regard to the three core mission areas of the UN: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. Now, the weakness largely results from a tension between liberalism that's associated with UN's human rights and socioeconomic development agenda, focused on the person, on the individual, and sovereign nationalism of its member states represented by their governments, which looks very different than this. On top of this, the rise of strongmen, the nationalist strongman leaders in many countries, has elevated the tension between liberalism and sovereignty, putting the UN system to test. Here, I'm not going to focus on the failure of the liberal system to respond to socioeconomic and sustainability needs globally. That I will save for another talk, and maybe we can, kind of piggyback on what Mona was talking about. But I'm broadly focusing on the tension between liberalism, and sovereignty for the global institutional level at the UN. Now, among scholars, there is broad, and these scholars are from vastly different ideological and theoretical backgrounds. There is wide agreement that there is a decline of the liberal international order. And as we examine, I'm going to be showing these cracks in the context of the COVID pandemic, in the context of the UN. So examining the first pillar of the UN, peace and security, the UN Security Council is the only governance body in the world that has the ability to make binding international decisions over its 193 countries. These can be enforceable. And this body historically shied away from discussing soft issues like health. They did not address health issues like health in the context of peace and security. Nevertheless, the UN Security Council has evolved, and they were able to have a recognition of infectious diseases, and at the time in 2000, the year 2000, they singled out HIV/AIDS as a threat to peace and security. And by 2014, when Ebola crisis was unfolding in West Africa, the Security Council responded by reinforcing the World Health Organization's guidance, and this is the UN agency. The WHO is the UN agency that's responsible for coordinating the global efforts to combat viruses. And they asked states at the time in 2014, they asked states to open their borders to ensure that needed assistance could get through the affected areas. This is in West Africa. And the actions of the Security Council to address the threats posed by Ebola really demonstrated the Council can be effective in containing the virus. But unlike in 2014, in 2021, Security Council passed a weak resolution that remained marginal, and it took 3 months to negotiate, and it didn't really address any of the needed actions that should have been responding to the virus itself. Shortly after the pandemic, Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked that the Council pass a resolution calling for a global ceasefire so that humanitarian aid could get to areas of need. But the Council was paralyzed. The struggle between China and the US really put the Council in a paralysis, and the nationalist impulses of both states have undermined this multilateralism. Trump administration threatened to veto any resolution that mentioned specialized agencies like the World Health Organization, and the US had pulled out of the World Health Organization by that time. And the US would not support any resolution that did not single out China as the source of the virus. Eventually, by July, the members were able to pass a weak resolution calling for a ceasefire, but not addressing the virus itself. And this case really highlighted the structural vulnerabilities of the UN, given the veto power wielded by these powerful states like the US and China that stands in the way of cooperation. Now, in addition to addressing peace and security, the UN focuses on human rights. And one of the issues that I talk about in the paper, which I wasn't covering here, was freedom of speech in the context of China and the kind of limiting the information to get out by the nationalist tendencies of the Chinese government. And Yong Li actually covered that in her talk, which was really actually nicely overlapping there. But in this context of human rights, the World Health Organization's mission is to achieve the highest possible level of health. And this is part of a global human rights agenda. And in this pandemic response, it has the World Health Organization has been the coordinating agency for global action. World Health Organization created a supply chain response system, supplying protective equipment to workers, test kits, courses in 6 languages, and over 50 guidance documents for healthcare workers, schools, workplaces. And there has been about 74 countries that are cooperating with the World Health Organization as a clearinghouse for the latest research. And here's kind of like an outline of what the World Health Organization is doing in relation to COVID-19 from its webpage. And it's been a vital organization to sift through all the noise out there, bring the scientific evidence that's developing and ever changing, and work with the leading scientists in the world to highlight best practices for dealing with an evolving crisis. Now, this knowledge of World Health Organization was built over decades. The WHO developed international health regulations in the 1960s, and WHO's assembly, which is 194 countries in the world, even larger than the UN's General Assembly, they meet every year to update the standards based on changing nature of global health threats. And the latest changes to the international health regulations were in 2005, when WHA defined public health emergencies of international concerns more broadly than they did before, and they included all potential disease outbreaks. And they decided, so all potential disease outbreaks should be reported as a public health emergency of international concern. And member states are obligated under this regulation to surveil, to verify, to cooperate, and they need to share information about these outbreaks with the World Health Organization, who then turns around and shares it with the world. Thus, we had a framework set up to prevent pandemics by combating epidemics. But the political gridlock among sovereign states got in the way. For these regulatory standards to work, states have to trust the system and put aside their perceived national interest and follow the guidelines. Yet during the pandemic, there has been pervasive non-compliance with WHO regulations, starting with the Chinese government, first failing to share information in a timely fashion, but also immediately, being reluctant to share the vital information that World Health Organization needed to secure a faster response. China was not the only country that disregarded WHO regulations. For example, WHO does not recommend travel bans as a strategy for addressing a pandemic. Instead, states are encouraged to focus on information sharing, research, testing, contact tracing, containment at the local level. States largely ignored these recommendations. The responses were uncoordinated, ad hoc, resulting in a patchwork of ever-changing state-imposed travel restrictions. And this detracted from effective measures. This also disrupted trade and supply chains, threatened to cause shortages of equipment, including essential medicine, food, or other humanitarian supplies, or doctors from getting from point A to point B to help with needed healthcare work. So instead of working through its regular protocols, the World Health Organization had to focus on a system of consolidated appeal for supply chain cooperation. And the WHO Secretariat has no formal authority to hold states to account about their regulations. The states need to voluntarily comply with these regulations. So there needs to be global action to ensure that states follow proper procedures and violators are held to account through collective action. Again, something that Mona was emphasizing, multilateral action as a necessity, is highlighted also here as well. And finally, the third pillar of the UN, which is sustainable development, is relevant in the sense that many states still lack the capacity to provide adequate healthcare for their citizens. And the pandemic was stacked on top of a global situation where half the population of the world today, 3.75 billion people, still lack access to essential health services. So the consequences of this has been disparate fatality rates across different countries and within countries as well. And we can talk about the vaccines. When I wrote the piece, the vaccines were not out there yet, but we can also talk about vaccines in this context in the Q&A or in discussion. So to respond to the urgent health needs of the world, the UN initiated 3 funds and appeals to help the immediate health needs globally. For these 3 funds, and they're varied in level of ask. So the UN goes to the member states that are rich and says, we need this funding so that we can address immediate health needs. As you can see, in this funding mechanism, 1.74 billion was asked and 59% funding was received, or what we call pledged by states. And many times states will pledge and then they'll drag their feet for many, many months before they actually fulfill their pledges. For global humanitarian need for the 50 most vulnerable countries, a funding of 7.32 billion was required. Only 19.7% was pledged. And for those countries that Mona was talking about, response and recovery funds targeting socioeconomic recovery of middle income countries, right? These rising countries that might be developing, $1 billion was needed just to plug into their economy so that they don't become a humanitarian crisis themselves. Only 5% of this funding was pledged. So as you can see from the slides, global cooperation when it comes to funding is severely insufficient. And socioeconomic development, good health and well-being as a human right, has been a part of this UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there has been some improvement over the years in the methods designed to address these development issues. But in a system where the operations of the UN agencies mainly depend on voluntary funding, the financial commitments made by the states in addressing these problems have fallen short, and this has been worsened during the pandemic. So this is not anything that's new, but it has been worsened during the pandemic. So in conclusion, well, against all odds, the United Nations has developed a strong infrastructure to address global problems in the past 75 years, and most states today recognize the benefits of cooperating through the multilateral arena to achieve mutual gains in all 3 of the UN's focus areas. But the full achievement of these goals are far off, and sovereign nationalism is a fundamental flaw within the structure of the international system to hinder progress. And this is especially true as the institutional weaknesses are exploited by leaders that have embraced nationalism and pulled back from international cooperation. So is the UN passing? I would say that its member states are the failure. UN is trying to pass despite its member states, the COVID test, that is. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your talk, Ilgu. We are moving into the question and answer portion of today's discussion. So we want to put our speakers in conversation with each other. I thought I would start things out by summarizing a little bit of what I heard today. Our speakers today have given us a global perspective on the COVID-19 crisis. We have learned more about its economic impact that is widening inequalities between the global north and the global south and increasing instability in developing economies. We've also learned more about COVID-19's relation to communication, or more properly, a lack of communication and transparency that has caused the pandemic to spread. And also, as we have learned in that amazing excerpt from the Wuhan Diary, that it's the pain and suffering of people have also been covered over, and there's been a lack of public mourning and grief that's needed. We've also learned the way that COVID-19 has revealed weaknesses in our ability to respond to global crises with effective measures for a number of reasons. And the sort of political gridlock, non-compliance, and lack of coordination that has made this pandemic so terrible. All three of these talks have pointed towards some similar themes, that the pandemic has allowed us to see kind of the profundity of institutional weaknesses and the problem of nationalism. Also a lack of response to the pandemic and the ways that it magnifies and increases growing inequalities. And also we have speakers who have talked about the sort of multilateral action that is needed, a sort of dramatic call to action. So I thought that I would begin by maybe asking our speakers to respond to what they've heard each other say, whether you have certain themes in your own accounts that you heard echoed in each other. So I thought I would open it up for our speakers to respond to each other before we go to the Q&A.
I can start if you want. I was taking notes as you guys were actually presenting. You know, I think that one of the issues that I've been thinking about has been this public-private partnerships that Mona was talking about. And you know, Sustainable Development Goals really has been elevating the public-private partnerships, and there's been a discussion in some of the global health circles talking about how these public-private partnerships are the answer to our problems. And it just seems to me, though, as we look at the response, especially with the COVAX, which is the vaccine response, and how that's being distributed. Now, the World Health Organization has a place where they say the way that we should distribute vaccines is 20% of all countries should be distributed, vaccinated, people who need it the most, and then you go to the second layer, and then you go to the second layer. But today, what we're seeing is that, you know, we're going to be reaching 45% in the United States soon, and then there are going to be some countries in sub-Saharan Africa who are not going to be reaching until 2024, right? So it just seems to me that these public-private partnerships, these decentralized production, and not coordinating at a very central system really fails to attempt to respond to a global pandemic that can't be confined in one place. So I'm going back to what Mona was saying, this is about a public response, but you can't do a public response at the sovereign national level. That public response has to take place in the global kind of federative level through a kind of a czar kind of a situation at the World Health Organization. And I recommend everyone to read the position paper from Lancet's editorial board their last issue, where they say they're calling for a czar, a global czar for vaccine distribution so that we can respond to the pandemic. Otherwise, there's not going to be a response.
I guess so. I should respond, Ilgu. You know, I am a critic of these PPPs, public-private partnerships. We see with the debt restructuring issue, the UN Economic Commission for Africa is taking this route that I think is very disturbing. Vera Songway's work on building the new repo market for Africa, where she wants venture capital to come in and to help rebuild Africa. And I think leaving it up ultimately to the funders of that system, BlackRock, big financial private investment funds, is super dangerous, because where's the accountability? With debt restructuring, I think we can put more kind of the onus on the UN Security Council for all its flaws, because they have, through the European sovereign debt crisis, interesting innovations where they were able to get Iraqi assets even prior to the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, where we'll talk about Greece, but Iraqi sovereign assets were off the table in terms of the restructuring, the debt restructuring in Iraq. And then again, certain Greek sovereign assets were off the table. They were not going to be sold to foreign investors. The problem, of course, is that the IMF is totally incapacitated. And that's a leadership flaw. That's also its relationship with the United States. So we are lacking a truly multilateral agency, that kind of, but I do think that the UN has some room to play here, except the UN, as you've outlined, has such a flawed history.
I count IMF as a part of the UN family, just so you know.
Really?
Oh,
Yeah. So these international
distant cousin.
Sure. But the UN, you think like all the monies that you put aside, you wrote down, they were very minimal. The IMF actually has $1 trillion, but it's only spent 1/10 of that. It's hanging around until August to do something about the new 650 billion in issuance. So there is a complete lack of leadership by the United States and by its, I hate to say crony, but by institutions like the IMF, who've long just kowtowed to the United States. And where's the UN in all of this? So I'm very, very pessimistic, unfortunately. But I do hope that, the United Nations the Security Council maybe. It looks quite dismal, to be very frank. And the thing is, we're looking at another lost decade, if not more, of stagnation and worse in the developing world. Okay, so I'm looking for some hope here.
Would I be able to ask a question to Young-Lee, actually? Young-Lee, I'm just wondering, again, thinking about in the context of human rights, thinking about freedom of speech and being able to kind of share information. What is your sense about how free the professional, you've presented in this context, right? The information that had come from the doctors was kind of filtered and then kind of prevented to come out. Do you think that this was happening earlier as well, and then it could have been prevented altogether? Is it the central government, or it was like there was also some talk about how the government in Wuhan didn't want to look bad to the central government, so that they kind of suppressed the information from getting out. So is there a sense that you have, like, where does like the crux of the freedom of speech lie in the context of China in that particular setting?
First of all, I have to introduce maybe a little bit of the in terms of social media censorship and why this WeChat group chat screenshot that's originally from this private kind of chat environment that Dr. Lee was in. So starting basically around the 2010-ish, if you publish any information that's later labeled as an untrue statement, similar to what Dr. Lee's statement was labeled by those police investigators, then you are actually subject to the law enforcement. So that was something that's being enforced since early 2010s. And many people, also, of course, this is not something new to internet censorship. The censorship history in Chinese culture has really long, and to the extent that people kind of also nativisms, they know how to get around with the system, and they are aware of this the existing censorship. They would internalize it and have a little bit of a self-censorship before they post those information. So that already is a part of the kind of everyday life exercise that people are aware of when they post something on social media, even the private chat group, and they are aware of that. In terms of those public health crisis or the information that spread online, because in China originally there is a very strict kind of reporting system. So it's I have been following the news since January 2020, but it wasn't very clear to what levels. It was just local levels they suppressed the news, or the provincial level, or when they report to higher central government that this type of suppression of the information was happening. Yeah, but of course, I talked about the initial transparency of the information and the communication about pandemic that was not there, that was absent, and many of the top officials in Hubei province, where Wuhan, this as the capital city in, actually were later replaced within a month by newly appointed officials who was a stronger background in terms of communicating with the public. And also I can connect a little bit to the question I see in the chat raised by the audience. That's also kind of a connected question because one of the audience member was asking about the confirm the case number seems low. And if you look at those numbers, and you can go to the Johns Hopkins Center and to track those original numbers and by province, and you will notice about 68,000 of them were actually in Hubei province. And around 4,500 death cases are also in Hubei province. And the initial stage of the outbreak in Wuhan was devastating, and many possibly COVID-related deaths were not reported. It's also similar to many places in the world and as well. But I would say after strict lockdowns, especially months of strict lockdown and enforcement, the nativisms, they're also asking for more transparent information, and the local government, provincial level government would update those numbers daily. Very clear the numbers break down by different regions in different provinces. So if you look at, again, a most populated city in China is Shanghai, with a population of 24 million. The confirmed local cases in total since the first outbreak happened in China is actually under 400 cases. That's really the work that was done with all the effort that, of course, the celebrity scientist was making. The nativisms are aware of how, to what degree they should obey those public health orders, and also the strict enforcement that government was able to implementing as well. If you are interested in more about, of course, I've been living in the US during the pandemic. If you're interested in more and want to read more about the actual living situation in China throughout different time period in pandemic, I would highly recommend New Yorker writer Peter Hassler's work, and he published a couple of pieces on his experience living in China during the pandemic. Okay, yeah.
Thank you
Can I
so much
respond to
for
some of the questions on?
Yes.
So Dr. Barros Arteaga, I assume Cesar is asking some of the questions about the dollar and the dollars that are being created for the US stimulus. By the way, they've amounted to about 5 trillion altogether thus far. How is that going to trickle down to the global south? And I think what is happening actually is sort of dangerous the United States is weaponizing its repo swap lines, its swap lines through the Federal Reserve, where countries that don't have direct access to the topmost tier, which is the C6 swap network, they can deposit their holdings of US Treasuries. For instance, China can do that, and receive US dollars. All of that is hidden. We don't have the data for that, unfortunately. So I've been talking to some journalists about getting a FOI to find the data. The problem is that it's not transparent where these treasuries are going, to which countries. And the larger problem is that these financial relationships are going to be weaponized by the United States to further its own hegemonic interests. So that's been happening with the vaccine program as well. You know, I am all for getting rid of intellectual property right now through the TRIPS agreements. Let's suspend intellectual property on vaccination and let's get the vaccines out there. 2024, it's too late for the global South. And we do have effective vaccines in the United States. We're going to see an excess supply of vaccines late summer. Okay, so this is when we really need to take into account suspending these very profitable IP regimes. Of course, that means overhauling the entire darn structure of global finance and global capitalism based on intellectual property rights and profits for the very few. But this crisis is as bad as it gets. And I think, at least for a temporary period, we can suspend those IP regimes. That's just part of the story. I do think, you know, the dollar and dollar hegemony is not going away anywhere, you know, and the Chinese are buying up dollars. So we're not switching to another regime, right? China is the world's biggest economy right now, but it's not the world's biggest financial power right now. Dollar hegemony has contributed to both ecological and economic imbalances. And to have this true kind of egalitarian global economy will require monetary egalitarianism. I'm afraid we're very far from that. But there are very good ideas circulating around. Right now, the stimulus, though, coming back to your question, Cesar, it's about trickle down, and it's about weaponizing and choosing your favorite interests and going for that. It doesn't solve the problem.
To our audience members, if you want to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A. And for our presenters, I just want to remind you, other people cannot see the Q&A. And so you might read parts of the question that you're addressing for the audience. I have a question for Young Lee. I was wondering if you could explain a little more about Little Pink's critique of Fan and it, like, so there's the nationalism side of it, but is it also gendered in a particular way? And also, I was very curious if you could come back to this image you shared, right? This children's book about the heroic doctor, the whistleblower in the United States, right? And if that's like a completely different narrative within China. So yes, if you could maybe contextualize some of these responses a little bit more, that'd be great. Thank you.
Basically, first question regarding the Little Pink. I was talking about a gray fire war. I'm not sure whether the audience actually are familiar with this term or not. So basically in China, you only have a fairly limited access to certain website. For instance, on the mainstream social media platforms in the US, such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, are all blocked. So this is just an example. And then there's a term we use in Chinese as a fanqiang, which means skirting the Great Fire War. So those Little Pink are the younger generation tech-savvy a group of young ultra nationalists who has the skill. They learned the technology to skirt the Great Firewall, and then to access to, for instance, Twitter or Facebook, and would target those people who they considered as ones, for instance, like Fang Fang, who would publish their work and then sabotaging China's image in the world. And then they would leave comments and even death threats on those posts that they post outside of the Great Firewall. So that's kind of a group of those little pink. And of course, the pink was versus to previous socialist period red. This is a different, so another reference to that in terms of color. And in terms of the Dr. Lee's story, and after he passed away, he was commemorated by netizens all over the world. And back in China, of course, the central government also realized the importance of his story and what he kind of experienced and what the story symbolized for the netizens and the public. So, of course, his original document that they left at the police station, the entire investigations, they were written after he passed away. And also, actually, along with Dr. Lee, there are 8 other whistleblowers who were interrogated by the police officer as well. Their cases are also overturned and were kind of embraced by the central government as a very positive hero as well. Of course, it's really tragic that Dr. Lee lost his life. The government also awarded him certain honors to kind of calm the nerves of the netizens who were really outraged on knowing what Dr. Lee experienced. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much. As we wait for more questions in the Q&A, I will continue to ask questions. Ilgu, I was very interested in you pointing out this rise of the sort of strong men. And this is something that stands out to me with the sort of lack of proper response to the pandemic seems partly around, there's almost like an ego in it. And also a sort of like, maybe not everyone's interested in a more egalitarian society. Maybe not everyone's really interested in human rights. And I don't know exactly how I'm trying to pose my question here, but it seems like there has to be some sort of way to argue that this world is just going to go up in flames if we don't address these inequalities. That even if you feel like you're benefiting from these inequalities, even if like more money is going in, if you're, you know, Bezos and more money is going into your account because you're benefiting from people being in lockdown, that ultimately the sort of political crises, instability, the sort of environmental crises, right, which Dr. Ali pointed out as well, that there's really, really pressing reasons to address this. And I don't know if our speakers have more to say about trying to address the fact that there are some people who think they benefit from this type of chaos and crisis and getting them to play, getting them to cooperate.
Well, I think, I mean, you know, I at the very beginning of my talk, I said I'm not talking about the failure of the liberal system to respond to socioeconomic problems, right? So it's kind of like UN had set up this system, and within the United Nations during the Cold War, there was some kind of like a discourse at the United Nations, right, where Soviets and the US were kind of butting heads about what part of the human rights frameworks that they would highlight. Soviets were all for positive rights, you know, healthcare, childcare, just those things that the states should provide for people so that they can have a dignified life. And the US side was emphasizing in rhetoric, not in reality, because their policies were contradictory when it comes to these issues. The US was emphasizing in the context of the UN human rights that should not be taken away from people, like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, right? So you end up with these two separate covenants of international covenant on civil and political rights and international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. And US is not a party to economic, social, cultural rights, but is party to the civil and political rights. So you had this division. On the economics development realm, the UN tried to kind of make the world more egalitarian by having the United Nations Development Program to and also UNCTAD, which is like this trade agency, and there was like these other agencies that the UN was developing for socioeconomic development. But the UN system, right, there are specialized agencies. They are like the IMF that we're talking about, and Mona was talking about the IMF. IMF is a part of the UN family as a specialized agency, but operates independently. So it's not, so the UN system itself could have been responding to some of these global inequalities through interaction of its member states. And the UN allows for that to happen in the context of the General Assembly, where, San Marino has the same voice as the United States. But the US and the Europeans said, no, we're not going to operate for for development issues from there, but what we're going to do is we're going to go to the IMF as the place. And that's where the liberal economic agenda has kind of consolidated itself, creating more and more and more inequality globally, right? So here we are, 75 years later, right? This global inequality cannot sustain itself, right? As you're pointing out. And the beneficiaries, like Jeff Bezos might not be a great example in this context, but like Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, are the largest investors in vaccine research, I think, in the world. Don't quote me on that, but they're up there if they're not the largest investor, right? So here we are, we have individuals who can actually say that, oh, okay, I'm going to surpass all of the states in the world to kind of donate to something that I want to donate to. And going back to, this goes back to what Mona was talking about, the accountability issue. There is no accountability when you set up a system where individuals can pick and choose what they want to invest in. That's why you need like a public system. But that public system also, if it is embedded in a liberal system, then you're not going to be able to respond to the global inequalities. So there has to be kind of breaks in both of those in order to be able to move forward from this gridlock that we're facing right now.
So Ilgu, I wanted to respond to that. I do know the figures for vaccine development. It's been, 4 billion from the United States, okay, 2.5 plus another 2, so 4.5 billion. And I don't know the funding for the Gates Foundation, but I'm imagining this 4 billion plus is very, very big. And so it's a public government, it's the United States government rather than one person or two people. The point you raise about the IMF being liberal, there's been a really interesting turn going back to, say, 15 years, where IMF research has actually been critical of neoliberalism. But IMF policy has continued with structural adjustment and with conditionalities and austerity. So it's very split. The research says something else, which is you need higher taxation, which is that you need to control global finance, but then the policymakers ignore all that advice, and that causes a lot of tension within the IMF. there's been a real flowering of research post the 2008 global financial crisis. This crisis that we're dealing with is far bigger. So the scale of the response needs to be far bigger in terms of the financing, in terms of the reconstruction. But it's also much more difficult, I find. I'm wondering, though, whether the fact that they're no longer just one hegemon, that it's now the United States, Europe, and rising China, and China's Belt and Road Initiative. And, you know, China has been very powerful last year, September, coming to the UN General Assembly and saying we're committed to net carbon emissions, right, by 2030. And so if China takes that step, right, that's a call for the United States, which it did, right? It has to meet that by committing to green infrastructure. So I don't think one can read the Biden infrastructure plan separate from the Chinese initiative back in September and its announcement at the UN General Assembly. In terms of research, there is so much interesting research out there, research by the UNCTAD, whose work I really love, and research by German NGOs and all kinds of academics. And that research is trickling through the UN system. And I think there's some sympathy on the part of Janet Yellen, which is promising. But so far, in terms of action, it's been so slow. And I'm hoping Janet Yellen is going to do more. She's going to do more in terms of the global minimum corporate tax. She needs to do it faster, and she needs to go bigger. And that's what we need to do. We need, you know, I've been teaching my students, we got to think, we're in a crisis. This is the biggest one we've seen in our lifetimes, bigger than 2008. We got to have a scale, you know, a response that fits the scale of the crisis. So we need to go at it in a multiplicity of ways, financial, medical, you know, you name it. And we also need to move fast. Okay. So, yeah, Ilgu.
Can I share my screen? Is that possible to share my screen for really quickly? And I don't know how much time we have. Okay, thank you. I will share. Let me do share here. This is the spending on research for the vaccine, and as you can see here, you're right that you know, there's a multiplicity of partners, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is among this $2.1 billion that was for Novavax, and then they, you know, they have other millions of dollars that are in there, but
you don't have the money for Pfizer or Moderna. I don't see that there. So I'm wondering how old or new this
right
is.
here. BioNTech, Moderna is mostly German governments.
Yeah, those numbers have gone up a lot. So this is not the correct number. It's about 2.5 billion. These are in millions.
So this is from the last Lancet. I'm just sharing. You know, I'm sure that it's shifting daily, and this is like a peer-reviewed publication. So
which was it, January or when? I mean, do you know the date? I know this number is dated. Oh, it's March. Okay.
So
anyway, I think,
I mean, I'm just saying that I totally agree with you, Mona, that we need a new paradigm, right? There has to be a paradigm shift in the way in which we do we approach these questions of economic sustainability and also human rights. Both of them, there has to be a paradigm shift, right? So, and there has to be a connection between the two. And Edith had a question about, after the Great Recession, there was a substantial initiative for new international monetary architecture. Has that initiative died down? And is the UN interested in pursuing this? You know, I mean, even I can tell you that even like the simplest things have been on, you know, the states are not willing to negotiate anything that kind of gets in their way, especially powerful states. where in the context of Addis Ababa agreement, there was a push for a global tax that would allow for states that are in the global south that lose through their trade, right? Some form of their livelihood, because there's foreign investment that comes in, it invests in producing products, and the only thing that this country will get is labor, but there's no externalities of this production is not kind of charged for, and then there's nothing that comes back in the form of a tax for this country, right? So they lose out in the trade realm. And that global tax never seen the light of day in the Addis Ababa agreement. It was all about these partnerships that Mona was talking about, right? So anytime there is some kind of enforceable regulatory framework that comes in, it's kind of pushed aside by especially the powerful states that tend to have more lawyers in the room than states that, you know, try to kind of keep up with the negotiations of these multilateral negotiations at the UN. So.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off that because the USTR is coming at it, going against this vaccination regime, right? It's both the United States through the USTR, the Office of Trade Representative, they're so anti-China and they're so anti kind of fueling a public vaccination option through the temporary suspension of the patents on these drugs. That's a real shame in my view. We're talking about human lives versus profits, and it's clear that, you know, profits take a precedence even in this unimagined, you know, crisis. Yeah.
I wish I had good news.
So do I. But the scholarship is flowering. It's a great time to be reading about these issues. If you want, you know, I teach some of these issues, and my students, I can't tell you, they are really engaging with the economic dynamics. And hopefully that generation is going to save us. So, all right, that's it from me. Thanks.
I do not see any more questions in the Q&A. So I wanted to maybe end on that note. Gen Z has to save us. Our students have to save us. But thank you to our speakers for presenting today, giving us a bigger perspective on the crisis that we're all enduring right now. And even if not giving us the best news, at least giving us some tools for thinking about it and seeing a way towards a better future. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.